Welcome to week 6 on Congress, the electoral context. What we're going to focus on this time is the electoral end of things and how elections influence congressional members' behavior. So the readings this week that we'll talk about at the end, both FENNO and MAYHEW, focus exactly on that. How does the threat or promise of re-election shape what our representatives do? The first thing I want to talk about is how much people just love to hate Congress, because that's going to shape a lot of our discussion on Congress generally. So if you look at Congress's approval rating, it really is abysmal. There are very few times in modern history where it's been anywhere near 50%, and really hovering around 20 most recently. You can see the one spike after 9/11, but that's pretty much par for the course for everything government-related after 9/11, and then a steep fall after. These numbers are from last year. I didn't pull this year's numbers yet. However, these numbers don't tend to change election to election. And in fact, after the last election, they had not changed. At the time this was taken, the president's approval rating, which was President Obama, was 46%. And that's not great. It's not awful, but it's not great. So if that's, kind of middle of the road, you can imagine where 16 might find you. It's pretty unimpressive. And so one of the things that I think it's important to point out is, we hate Congress. And as I've said, that kind of really shines through in these numbers. But what about our individual members of Congress? So if you ask sane people, whether you disapprove or approve of Congress, and then go and ask them whether they approve or disapprove of their individual representative, more people are likely to approve their own representative's job, regardless of anything else. So we go from, around 20 to 46% in 2013. They don't ask this question as often. In fact, they used to ask it a lot, and now we don't get it so much anymore. But most people, it bumps up their approval rating. And if you know your congressional representative's name, just know their name. You are more likely to approve of them. And in fact, if you see this number here, 62, we go back, that same number, 46. So that's almost 20 percentage points difference if you know the name. People like their congressional representatives, but they don't like the institution, or at least how the institution works. So let's talk about why that is. So one of the ways we can look at why people like their members of Congress but don't necessarily like Congress is through the electoral process. Now, the easy answer is to say, well, we don't like what Congress does. But there are studies to show that that actually is a kind of mixed bag. It really depends who you ask, when you ask them, and how much information you give them, whether people actually like what Congress does or not. So why don't we look at the difference between our own representatives and the institution? And a good way to do that is through elections. So I'm going to go through a series of factors that influence the way we get the congressional representation we get. And I mean that on both an individual level, like how do we get the representatives and senators we have, but also on a institution-wide basis. How do we get the makeup of Congress that we get? So the first thing we have to look at is who is allowed to be in Congress. The age requirements differ a little bit. House of Representatives, it's 25. Senate, it's 30. Most people are older than this when they run for either of those offices, although representatives tend to be a bit younger when they start. Citizenship length, there is not a requirement that you are a citizen at birth, but instead a length of citizenship, so 7 years for House of Representatives, 9 years for the Senate, and residency. And this is important here. in the House of Representatives, you have to live in the district that you represent. In the Senate, you can live anywhere in the state. And so states like Michigan that have vastly different population centers might pull different people on statewide races than they would pull on a district level race. Next, let's look at how these offices are apportioned and the election basics. So the House of Representatives, per state, there's a minimum of one. Many states have more than one, including Michigan. But the Senate has a set number of 2 per state. So that influences the size of the district. Now, looking specifically at the House of Representatives, every 2 years the entire House is up for grabs. Now, we know that most of our representatives in the House of Representatives are reelected every time. There's not as much turnover as you might think. And we'll talk about some of the reasons why. But theoretically, every 2 years, the entire thing could start over fresh. So there's 435, as we mentioned last time. There's also 6 non-voting members that are voted in, 5 delegates from various territories, and 1 commissioner from Puerto Rico who serves a 4-year term as opposed to the delegates' 2-year terms. Those are all non-voting members, so there's still 435 votes. Every 10 years, through the process of reapportionment and redistricting, the districts are subject to change. And that means the geographic region that each representative actually represents may change. And we'll talk about how this influences different races for these positions and different positions themselves. The Senate is a little more stable. There's 6-year terms. They're staggered, so the entire body is not up for re-election at any one point in time. It's split into thirds. There's 100 senators. There's no non-voting members. And the change in the area represented never happens. It's always from the states, and unless there's some state change in territory, which is extremely rare this day and age, the actual region that they represent never changes. So factor 3 is voter turnout, and what you can see here is a comparison of voter turnout rates between 2016 and 2018. Now, 2016 was a presidential election year, and as you can see, the national turnout rate was over 50%. 2018 was a midterm year, and the turnout rate was 46.4%. Now, I want to be clear that this turnout rate was exceptionally high in 2018. Historical rates for midterm years are right around 40%, if not lower. So we're looking at an outlier here. Even still, though, what you can see is that more people turn out to vote in a presidential year than turn out to vote in a non-presidential year. And this really does matter. Remember, the elections for House of Representatives happen every 2 years. And so every 2 years, the entire House of Representatives is up for grabs. But the people who turn out in 2018 versus 2016, or just generally in midterms versus presidential years, are very different types of voters. And these voters tend to be more partisan and more likely to support several partisan candidates, not in addition to Congress. And this has an effect on how Congress continues to run. One of those things is that not just is the House of Representatives getting a more partisan vote in off-cycle elections, but the Senate seats that are open in off-cycle elections tend to align with the more partisan sentiments. So the Senate seats that were up for grabs in 2018 tended to be in what are typically thought of as red or conservative states. And that has an effect on how Congress turns out when it is all said and done. When the new Congress is sworn in January of the following year, you're going to see a Congress that more represents those partisan swings in a midterm year. You don't tend to have that more swing voter that sits in the middle and can go either way that you might have in a presidential election. And this impacts how members of Congress feel during different election cycles, who they feel they need to cater to, and how they market themselves, whether it's in a more partisan fashion or in a more neutral or look at this from a myriad of ways. Non-Hispanic whites are more likely to turn out in midterm years than non-Hispanic blacks. Hispanics in general are less likely to turn out, as are other races. And by age, you can see that the older you get, the more likely you're to come out, the more likely that you will come out for a midterm race to vote. And the younger you look, the less likely people are to turn out to vote. That means the people who are doing the electing in midterm years, and remember, that means the entirety of the House and a third of the Senate, those people are predominantly white, predominantly older, and in many cases are predominantly more conservative. And so it's no surprise that in some ways the House of Representatives is dominated by the Republicans in recent years because the people who turn out to vote look more like Republican voters, generally speaking, than Democratic voters. But this doesn't explain the whole difference. So we need to continue to look. One important factor is incumbency advantage. And incumbency advantage is the advantage that a person gets by already holding the office. An incumbent is someone who already already occupies the office, but in some ways does own it. So there are a variety of reasons why there's an advantage for the incumbent. As we'll talk about in a couple of minutes, redistricting and gerrymandering ensure that districts are drawn for the representatives that are already there, not the constituents' needs that might change over time. So representatives who are longstanding representatives are likely to ensure that districts are drawn in their favor. Money. Incumbents need less, but actually get more money when it comes to fundraising. And that's because the return on investment is higher. People know that they're going with a proven winner. And also with someone who has probably more power in Washington, D.C. than someone who's a challenger. So it's a safer investment, better return on investment. And in some ways, they're raising money to raise money. It makes it easier down the road, and it helps other candidates nearby in their party. Name recognition. So as we talked about, if you're able to name your member of Congress, you're more likely to approve of the job that person is doing. And so that becomes a factor in whether people are likely to vote for you or not. Most voters don't have a ton of information when they go into the voting booth. And so having just a name that they recognize is an important thing. So the picture to the left is John Dingell, who, by the way, has one of the most hilarious Twitter accounts. He's a big U of M football and basketball fan, big Tigers fan, etc. So watching his Twitter during sporting events, very fun. Anyhow, was a representative in Michigan for quite some time. One of the longest serving representatives in the House of Representatives, and recently retired. His wife now represents the same district, Debbie Dingell. But part of that is name recognition, and that's the same for her. She actually gains some benefits off of name recognition from him. So people who have the name and continue to use it to their advantage have just kind of that built-in advertising advantage. Media coverage. If you are the representative in a district, you are likely to have events in that district, you are likely to attend events in that district, and thereby get free media coverage that a challenger just cannot get. Constituency service. You may have heard, especially older people tend to say, well, I'll call my congressional representative about that, I'll call my member of Congress, etc. So things like Social Security checks, passports, that type of thing. People will call their congressional representative, even if it's the right office or not. Many times it's not. And they'll point them in the right direction, and sometimes they'll help them out with the problem. That constituency service only reaches a small number of people, but certain political science studies have shown that even though it's a small number, it's enough to explain incumbency advantage in small and tight races. Running for Congress by running against Congress. Now, even though John Dingell and now John Conyers and many others have been in the House of Representatives for a long time, when they run ads to get reelected, 9 times out of 10, those ads reference the idea that they can be trusted, Congress can't, and so send them to Congress to clean it up. In other words, I'm running for Congress to go clean up Washington. And that's not just challengers that say that. That's incumbents that say it every single time. People who've been there for decades will say the same thing. So they run for Congress by running against it, by essentially putting down the body that they're running for. This is especially true for representatives, but it's also true for senators. Spending in district. Representatives and senators are able to secure projects for their districts and states in larger appropriations bills, and as long as they properly advertise that, they can claim that some benefit to their constituents for that. And finally, responsiveness to electorate and district. At the end of the day, representatives are actually responsive to the people that they are elected by. The problem that we tend to see is that not everybody agrees, and so we have representatives who are beholden to their constituents in various areas that have very different notions about what the right way to do things is. If we look just at the connection between the representatives and the electorate, most of the time the successful ones are actually fairly responsive to the electorate. So, if incumbency can't explain everything, although it's a big factor, the opposite of that is open seat races. When an incumbent retires or dies, or someone just decides not to run for whatever reason, that opens up the possibility in many cases that there is what's called an open seat. And a true open seat is one where either the Republican or the Democrat has an equal chance of winning, or at least a legitimate, significant chance of winning. So there is a race to the race. There is a race to announce who is going to be the candidate for each party. And sometimes this might reveal the fact that it's not truly open. If it's a House of Representatives district, what does the district look like? What does the electorate look like? Have they ever elected, if it's someone vacating the seat as a Republican, have they ever elected a Democrat in that district before? Or is that just going to go to the next person who's a Republican? Also, the year of the opening. Remember, I told you a couple of factors ago that their voter turnout in off years or midterm years is lower than presidential years. So if this is a midterm year and not a presidential year, do we expect a Republican or a Democrat to be able to win? And spending in open seat races just soars. It's kind of a little bit out of control. In 2014, we had an open Senate seat when Carl Levin retired in Michigan. The Republican candidate, who is on the right there, Terry Lynn Land, former Secretary of State of Michigan, spent over $11 million, really close to $12 million on the race. Gary Peters, who won the race, spent $9.5 million. So all said and done, about $20 million was spent. Actually, a little bit over $20 million was spent on this one Senate race. In fact, that is about $2 for every person in the state of Michigan, because there is just under 10 million people in the state of Michigan. To be exact, it's $2.17 per constituent. So we can see that when there is a chance at an open seat, this spending is kind of out of control. $20 million for a Senate seat. But spending does not necessarily lead to a win. The person who spent the most in this election did not win. So money is a factor, especially in open seat races. Now the one that everybody loves to pick on, redistricting and gerrymandering. First, as I note on the bottom of this slide here, I'm going to put up two very important videos that I want you to watch. One is a video on redistricting from the Washington Post that talks about the different shapes of districts. Another is a video about reapportionment. Now, many people kind of understand the redistricting process. Not everybody understands the reapportionment process. So let's talk about what I mean here. Reapportionment is the process by which we go through the census every 10 years, and there's politics of that, who gets counted, how much money we put to counting people, etc. But beyond that, when we get a new count of how many people are in a state, our number of representatives may go up or down based on that. Michigan lost representatives last time around, lost one, I think, if I'm remembering correctly, last time around because of a loss in population. So how do you divide up the remaining spots? That's redistricting. Now, the Constitution, the U.S. Constitution, leaves redistricting up to the state legislatures. Some state legislatures have handed over that responsibility to a board, usually a nonpartisan redistricting commission, either made up of judicial branch members or members of the public or a combination of some of these things. There was a Supreme Court case in 2015 because people challenged Arizona's decision to do this, saying that the Constitution specifically states state legislatures have to do the redistricting, but Arizona gave it to this board. However, the Supreme Court said as long as the state legislature gave it to the board, then essentially they're the ones doing the redistricting. So that's the plain and simple. Reapportionment is the number of representatives in each state based on population. Redistricting is how the lines are drawn for each of those districts. Gerrymandering is when redistricting goes wrong. Now, it's not always illegally wrong, but it is not necessarily the best way to draw lines. And there might be different reasons to do it. So gerrymandering is named after a governor of Massachusetts who decided to draw a district that looked like a salamander. His last name was Jerry, and hence the name gerrymandering. This was a long time ago, and so I guess people were just really creative that day and age. So gerrymandering can be done to try and dilute people's votes on the basis of political party, so trying to benefit one party over the other. It can be done on the basis of trying to dilute people's votes on the basis of race. Now, on the basis of race, that has been roundly decided to be unlawful under the Voting Rights Act. However, on the basis of political party, there is some question left open to that. And there are a few cases, one in Wisconsin that has gone up to the district court and will be headed to the circuit court level, federal courts, and actually one forthcoming in Michigan about political gerrymandering and whether it is unconstitutional and or a violation of the Voting Rights Act. So make sure to watch the videos that I posted. They describe them in a little more depth and with some visuals that I think are really helpful. But here's some visuals. This comes from the Washington Post wonk blog, and you can see on the left that if you have 50 people, where 60% of them are blue, well, let's just say Democrat, because that's clearly what they're talking about here, and 40% are red, you can divide them up in different ways to get different numbers of representatives. 5 districts, right? You're given 5 districts, 50 people. The first is perfect representation. You draw the lines that that are straight, narrow, looks, somewhat right. And you get the balance of representation based on ideology that you would expect from the percentages of people involved. The other way is to kind of cut across people where it is more compact but ideologically unfair, or you can argue ideologically neutral. In some ways, that ideological neutrality really leads to one party winning over another because they're going to dominate every single one of those districts. Another way is really how our districts work, which is neither compact nor fair. So you can have a situation where you end up having more red districts despite the fact that you have less red people involved in this population. And in fact, many of our states look like number 3. In fact, number 3 looks a lot more fairly drawn than many of our states. So the common response to people's claims that gerrymandering is ruining the world is that, gerrymandering only explains part of what's going on in society, and that is absolutely true. The American public is more polarized politically than ever before. And you can look over a 20-year span and see how the median Democrat and the median Republican move away ideologically on a spectrum over time. So that in 1994 and even in 2004, people who were the middle of the road in both of their parties were fairly close to one another, and there is a lot of overlap. However, when you get to 2014, if you look at that chart, you see that the medians move away. That means that there are more people on the extremes pulling those views away, and less people in the middle pushing the views together. And so it's hard to say that because our political parties, seem really divided right now, that this isn't something we kind of have brought on ourselves. We are much more polarized in a way. But Congress has certainly gotten more polarized over time. What you're looking at here is a graph, actually 2 graphs, that measure polarization ideologically in Congress over time. On the left is 1951. You see a lot of crossover, a lot of blue crossing over into red territory, people having mixed ideologies, a solid middle, right, of both parties. In 2011, you see a lot of split, and you see very few people crossing over. In fact, the only people really crossing over are blue people and not red people. And that suggests that the parties are really polarized, that they don't share a lot of ideological beliefs, and in fact that the parties are cohesive in their own internal ideologies, but that they don't have a lot of crossover. So when we look at the fact that the population is polarized, it's not surprising that Congress is polarized as well. So to go back to our original question, why do people hate Congress? Well, one of the answers they give is that there's just so much gridlock and it's so polarized. Well, the American public can be partially to blame for that because we are more polarized as well. And that is due in part to the fact that we have geographically sorted ourselves. So what you're looking at here are 2 graphs that are done geographically. The first in 1960, the second in 2016. These are county level graphs. The darker the blue, the more polarized that county is, meaning the more lopsided it is. If you look at 1960, most counties are a light form of blue at most, and usually more in the white. That there is little polarization in most counties, that there is a more balanced political ideology. In 2016, that can't simply be said. There are many counties that are highly polarized, that are likely to never vote in a swing fashion. So that means that geographically, people have kind of sorted themselves, right? That we know there are some districts that Republicans are never going to win or Democrats are never going to win, and that isn't because of the representatives. That's because of the electorate in those districts. So not only are we more polarized, but we have also sorted ourselves geographically based on this polarization. So all in all, it's not surprising that we find Congress to be a little bit stuck, a little bit polarized, a little bit gridlocked, because it is. But whether you can blame the representatives themselves or not depends on the specific question being asked. So let's take a broader look on Congress, and especially electorally. The first thing I want to point out is that being a member of Congress is a constant battle in dual membership. This was first noted by Edwin Burke, who is a political theorist. And Edwin Burke said that a legislator had to be both a statesman who represented the people who elect him, meaning his constituents, and a national representative representing the National Assembly he is part of. So sometimes these two identities will be at odds with one another. So an example of this, Michigan lawmakers voting in an auto bailout situation. Are they representing their district, or are they representing the nation? Or Kentucky legislators during debates on global warming that involve fossil fuels, and in particular coal plants. Are they representing their district, or are they representing the nation? This splits legislators' loyalties on a constant basis. And one way to look at that is representative versus candidate. When you have 2-year terms in the House, people are perpetually candidates. There's very little time to govern and then get back to running for office. In fact, it's just perpetual candidacy. The Senate allows for a little more breathing room. 6 years is a longer term. But that doesn't mean senators are not mindful of the fact that they have to get reelected next time. So when we talk about this, is this why incumbents are almost always reelected? Where do they draw the line in acting like a candidate or a representative? Also, there are two Congresses based on the parties. Parties distinctly feel differently about Congress. Now, this is changing rapidly in a new presidential era, as it sometimes does, but I have a feeling this is a little bit different. So each party operates a little bit differently depending on the times and the issues involved. For example, the 2009 Congressional Democrats are not at all the same as the 2016 Congressional Democrats. And you could argue that the 2016 Congressional Democrats, even though they might be the very same people, are not the same as the 2017 Congressional Democrats. Times change, issues change, and therefore the way that the parties operate change. Now, one other dichotomy that I think people rely heavily on when they criticize Congress is the fact that members of Congress are elite in many ways. This isn't necessarily a good or bad thing. It's just that they are typically wealthier, more educated, better connected, and more policy-oriented than the people they can meet from their districts. So if that's the case, they travel in different circles, they don't necessarily have the same personal concerns, and that separates them a bit from their constituents and actually makes them more like the people that they are elected to serve alongside. FENNO, Richard FENNO, wrote about the idea that congressional representatives have to develop a home style and a hill style. This is another one of those dichotomies, right? The home style being a constituent-focused style that leads to re-election, because they are mindful that regardless of their technical job on the Hill, they have to get reelected to continue to do that. But eventually, they have to develop a style that will allow them to gain power in Congress. And this is their Hill style. So FENNO, in the section that you have, this is part of a much longer work, talks about how members of Congress can tend to their home while they are on the Hill. And that most people, when they're first elected to Congress, spend their first couple of terms being primarily concerned with getting reelected. This is specifically about representatives, right? Because senators have a longer lifespan in their first term, and so they have more room to maneuver. But members of the House of Representatives need to be concerned about the fact that in 2 years they need to get reelected. And the reason he points this out is because there are often times where your home style and your hill style will come into conflict. If you are concerned with gaining power within Congress itself, then you're going to spend more time in DC and be more concerned about national affairs. If you're more concerned about your constituents, you're going to spend more time in your home district. So FENNO is really talking about the difference in how you allocate time depending on where you are in the career. And so this signals, right, where you are in your career and how much power you have within the halls of Congress. Most people who get leadership roles are there because they know they're in safe districts or at least in a safe position in the next election. Their fellow members of Congress aren't going to elect them to leadership positions if they feel like they might be gone in 2 years. So people develop a home style that allows them to tend to their constituency without giving up the desire to find power in DC. The second of our readings this week is David Mayhew's Congress, the Electoral Connection. And this builds off of what FENNO is saying. Actually, FENNO really built off of Mayhew in a way. But what Mayhew says is that members are hyper-focused on their re-election goal, that this is really their primary goal. FENNO was saying, no, there are some institutional concerns. Gaining power in the halls of Congress is a concern as well. But Mayhew says, really, what matters at the end of the day is whether you get reelected or not. And the reason why this matters for Mayhew is because behavior changes reflect the fact that reelection is your goal. So he can categorize or type activities into 3 primary categories. The first is advertising. Advertising is simply putting your name out there in a pleasurable way that allows people to connect your name to something nice, but does not have to necessarily be something related to policy or a specific vote. In fact, it's probably better if it's not, because every vote is going to have its proponents and opponents. Advertising, though, is a way to get your name out there, get your face out there, in a way that is non-threatening to people who might not agree with you politically, but is endearing to all. So in-district activities like ribbon cuttings, or usually coffee hours, or going to a senior citizens center, that type of thing, those are all advertising, according to Mayhew. The next is credit claiming. In a big package bill that distributes money, claiming credit for getting your district some money out of that bill. That's credit claiming. In a bill that provides for certain things for some of your constituents, maybe it's a benefit like expanded Medicaid and the Affordable Care Act. You have to be able, though, to connect your activities to that in some way. Now, you can do that with a mere vote, but it's better if you have a hand in shaping it or ushering it through Congress. Finally, the third activity is position taking. Position taking does not necessarily mean that you will succeed in something, but merely that you have taken a position, one way or another, on a topic. This might be through a vote, but it might be through floor speeches that aren't even about any pending legislation, but members get certain time every day to make floor speeches. It might be through your newsletter. It might be through coffee hours or speeches in district. It might just, this day and age, be through your social media channels. So position taking is a way to show your constituents that you care about them by showing them that you are taking positions on issues that matter to them. Now, necessarily you're going to alienate some that don't agree with you, but if you are actually adhering to what your constituency sent you to Washington to do, guess what? You should be golden. So Mayhew points to everything being electoral, whereas FENNO points to the idea that members of Congress, after they have secured re-election, may actually look to gain power within the confines of Congress itself. So what does this all mean, right? What is all of this in the grand scheme of things? Well, ultimately what this means is that we cannot talk about Congress without talking about re-election or elections generally. Why? One, because constituents shape what Congress looks like. We may not like what Congress looks like, but in fact that might be, at least in part, due to the fact that we cannot agree on policies ourselves. So that's one thing. Two, another important factor to take out of this is that many of these structures, whether they be districts and redistricting or gerrymandering, or the terms of office, or when people's re-elections happen, those structural factors influence how people vote or whether they vote at all, and therefore might influence whether we like Congress or the output Congress is giving us. Ultimately, we need to look at the activities that our congressional representatives do as part of their re-election bid as much as part of what they do as members of Congress, but also as our representatives, because those, while they're two distinct things, are connected, and there's a lot of overlap in activities.